Good day, and thank you for joining Black Agenda Report. I'm Margaret Kimberly. Please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and read blackagendareport.com. Gerald Perreira is the chairperson of the Organization for the Victory of the People in Guyana. He joins us from Guyana to discuss the America's Counter-Cartel Coalition, known as Shield of the Americas, the latest iteration of the U.S. self-asserted right to control the entire hemisphere. How is Guyana, a member of the Shield of the Americas, impacted by these actions? How is it impacted by U.S. control being exercised in Venezuela, which borders Guyana, and by securing Guyana's resources? We ask these questions as the U.S. continues its siege against the people of Cuba, some of whom are immigrating to Guyana in response to the devastation being wrought by the U.S. And thank you so much, Gerald Perreira. It's nice to have
Thank
you.
you. Thank you very much.
So there's a lot going on there.
Yeah.
Let's begin by talking about this Shield of the Americas and Guyana's involvement.
Well, the Americans, they refer to it as this coalition against the drug cartels. But you know, all of those boats that were bombed in the sea, in the Caribbean Sea, not one of those boats were carrying drugs. They were fishermen. And ever since the bombing of those boats, the fishermen from different parts, from Trinidad right up to St. Lucia and other parts, they're not going out. They're not venturing out too far from the mainland. Two brothers lost their lives in Trinidad, and I think the family is bringing a case against the Trinidadian government. And the Prime Minister of Trinidad came out in defense of what happened. In one of the boats, there was a survivor, and he was shouting for help. And I think the captain or for the boat got permission from Pitexit, and he said to just finish it off. That's well documented. It's across the Caribbean. But Guyana and Trinidad broke ranks with CARICOM. Jamaica to a certain extent, but Guyana and Trinidad went along completely and joined the Shield of the Americas, which is really a body that is going to help Trump recolonize. This is, part of these two governments are on board Trump's the fascist agenda of Trump, because Trump he is taking the Monroe Doctrine to a different level. He has no respect for our sovereignty, and they talk to our leaders in very bullying. The language is very bullying. For example, the U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Christopher Lando is going to arrive in Guyana tomorrow in relation to energy talks. It's part of a regional, he's going around the region. But it's really about taking control of our resources, because we have uranium. And the Americans there's a Canadian company that will be involved in the mining, but it has the blessings of the US. But the people, the indigenous community and others, we're organizing to resist it. And the American government has also taken over the bauxite company. This was an entity that was nationalized during Forbes Burnham, when Forbes Burnham was president, was nationalized. And now the Americans are taking it over. The Americans, they said in very plain language that it's to counter the Chinese influence in this area. Well, we have had relations with China since the early 70s. The Chinese built clay brick factories here, and they did a lot for Guyana. And if you look at the track record, the United States has never done anything for Guyana. There's not a bridge that they built or a factory they built or anything to show. So most of those projects were done by the Chinese since around 1973, since from 73, 74 on. So this is what is happening. But the Ali government and the Kamala Bissessa Prasad in Trinidad are fully aboard, because what they're doing, as we pointed out, they're helping Trump to whiten America, to whiten the United States, to kick out black and brown skinned people out of the United States, and they're fully on board with this. I mean, the USS Nimitz was in the area it couldn't come into Guyana because the water too shallow. So they sent a helicopter for President Ali, and he went on board that ship. And we called him out for doing what was morally wrong, because he endorsed the unjust and illegal war against Iran. And he came out. He said nothing about, there's so many other issues that he did not touch on, but he attacked Iran when Iran did nothing. Iran was attacked, but he stood firmly, he and Bissessar stood firmly with the Trump regime. So Guyana is, we're supposed to be, we're celebrating 60 years of flag and anthem independence. And even Burnham recognized that, like in Nkrumah. Burnham said political independence without economic independence is meaningless. So we have our own flag and anthem and high court and what have you, but the economy, the dominant force in the economy is white monopoly capital, the Canadians, the Australians, and others. And then we have the local comprador bourgeoisie and the big business people who are mainly of Indian ethnicity. They control strategic sectors of the economy. So African Guyanese, like Africans across the Caribbean, we make up, like with the exception of Trinidad and Guyana, where you have more Indians than Africans. The other countries across the Caribbean, where 98% are descendants of captured Africans, we don't control the economy. We don't have any say. We don't play any part in the strategic sectors of the economy, despite black faces in high places.
Well, that's a familiar story, isn't it?
Yes,
Black people in high places playing the role of they're actually puppets. But you talked about Forbes Burnham, and who was prime minister in the 60s, I believe, was he not?
Yes, 60s, and he died in 85 as president.
And nations throughout the global South, especially in this hemisphere, where the U.S. is such a great, and by great I don't mean to use that word in any positive way, but a great military and economic power, which can dictate to other countries. But we see this all the time. We see that whenever nations in this hemisphere attempt to have some self-determination, some independence, the U.S. always interferes. We can start with Haiti, the kidnapping of a president, and before that, decades of support for a puppet regime, the invasion of Grenada, this tiny country that was socialist for a brief moment, interfering in the affairs of Jamaica. I'm remembering Prime Minister Michael Manley. Venezuela, right next to Guyana, where they literally kidnapped the president, are stealing the oil, who brag about stealing the oil money, taking billions of dollars out. It's a long litany of U.S. control, and the names may change. They may have a shield of the Americas and claim they're fighting drug cartels. It could be any number of things. It's the Caribbean, it's Guyana and other South American nations, interference in elections. What is, having said all of that, what is the way forward for people in your country and in the region to fight against U.S. imperialism?
I think where a lot of us have been, the mistakes that we don't seem to be able to learn from the mistakes in the past. I'm talking about the left and the progressive forces. If we look, we need to, we focus too much on electoral politics, and we just keep exchanging the managers of what we refer to as the neo-plantation. We want to dismantle the plantation. George Beckford, the great Caribbean political economist, wrote a book called Persistent Poverty. And he and others like progressive economists and friends of Cuba like Norman Gorfan, they pointed this out. We need to, and this is what the Grenadian Revolution did. We need to organize. You can talk about dual power, but we don't. The only time there's no permanent organization. We only mobilize the people when it's elections every 5 years, and then the people return they gone back to sleep. So we need to create the structures that will have people in permanent inactivity. And the political parties are not involved in mobilizing the people. We don't reach out to elevate the people's consciousness. Few do. So, for example, in Guyana, we have Exxon. Let me give you an example, like ExxonMobil and the Canadians. They've taken over thousands of acres of land. And all of the mainstream parties who are in the parliamentary opposition, they don't say anything about it because they all subscribe to neoliberal economics. And they don't challenge the Americans because they have properties in the United States, they have bank accounts in the United States and the UK, and their children study at universities abroad. So they don't rock the boat. And those who rock the boat or say things, we are denied jobs, we're denied, we can't even get transit visas, much as visas, and we're hassled at every airport we go through. Few airports. So this is what they do. But we need, getting back to the question you raised, is that we need to create, as Maurice Bishop and others had done before the existence of the New Jewel movement, was to create movement for assemblies of the people in every community where people need to understand that liberation, no one will bring liberation to you, that we are our own liberators. Che Guevara said that. He said, I'm not a liberator, no one liberates another. We have to liberate ourselves, but we cannot do it individually, and that's why we have organization. We fight collectively in organization. But the thing is to just not mobilize, but to organize the people in structures so that when the US put pressure on the government, the people can hit the streets in their hundreds of thousands. And that is what they did when the pressure was coming down on Burnham. Burnham brought the youth and the people into the street. And after he died, President Hoyt took the party on a right-wing course. But I just want to say this quickly on this program, and it's important. You know, when Maurice Bishop and others seized power, when they kicked out Eric Gary, there was a boat. President Burnham sent 2 trawlers that sailed from Guyana with weapons to Grenada to help the revolutionaries, and they were backed up by units of the Guyana Defense Force. So we played a role in that, in helping them to secure the Fort Rupert, I think it was. And when the Cubans went to Angola, the Cuban planes were landing in Barbados and refueling. And Errol Barrow was the prime minister, and the US placed tremendous pressure on Barrow, and Barrow pulled out of it. And Burnham picked up it and said, look, the Cuban planes can refuel in Guyana. And the US government said they were going to bomb the international airport here. But the Cuban troops came here and went on to Angola. And when they were going, some Guyanese, some units, a few Guyanese soldiers went along to get the battle experience. But this is not something that is much talked about. And the point I'm making is that Barrow, Burnham, and Manley was destabilized, and they did the same to Burnham. And what was sad, sister, was sad, because I went to the launching of a book by a veteran WPA, Working People's Alliance activist, of which Walter Rodney was one of the founders. And we had 3 parties that were meant to be all claiming the anti-imperialist mantle and said that they're pursuing the socialist path of development. And we missed the historical opportunity of coming together to form a united socialist front. And what was sad was that the same WPA that could not, Walter Rodney's party, well, he had died. After he died, they could not find common ground with Burnham. They entered into a coalition with Burnham's successor, who took the party on a full right-wing course and implemented neoliberal economics, and we are paying the price of that up to today. So after 60 years of independence, there's no sovereignty. Our sovereignty have been usurped. Our independence is trampled upon. When you listen to the US ambassador to Guyana, she talks like a governor and nobody challenges her. So this is what is happening. So our resources, Guyana is a very rich country in resources. You name it and we have it. We have uranium, gold lands and everything. And yet we're supposed to be the fastest growing economy in the world. And the price has gone up and people get starvation wages. And of course, they're poor, very, poverty. There's abject poverty and so among the indigenous people, among poor Indians and Africans. But the strategic sectors of the economy is controlled by foreign capital and by local wealthy, the big Indian and Portuguese businesses.
I mentioned you sent me this article about the U.S. government, not just a corporation, but the
Yes.
U.S. Defense Department, they're calling it the Department of War,
War, yes.
uh, has purchased a bauxite mine to curtail Chinese dominance in the country. So they are literally, I guess this is the consolidation of fascism, isn't it?
It
They are
is.
cutting out the middleman. It's not
That's
even a
right.
U.S.
Yes,
company rather, that's
that's right.
doing it.
That's right. And if you revisit what Mussolini said about his definition of fascism, this is what you're seeing. Exactly. So, and the Guyana government, they never consulted anyone. They didn't talk to the unions or anybody. They just went ahead. But what is happening is the Americans come in and tell them what to do, and they just go along with it. You know, Rubio came, I think I mentioned this to you, Rubio came into Guyana and told them to send home the Cuban Medical Brigade. And people are very up in arms against it. People are annoyed because the Cuban doctors, had it not been for the Cuban doctors in Guyana, our health system would have collapsed years ago, because we have areas. Guyana is a huge country, the hinterland, into the forest areas, the jungles, that you would not get a local doctor, a Guyanese doctor, to go. And the Cubans, both women and men, doctors, went into those areas to work to service those communities. So when you send home the Cubans, that there's nobody to service those communities. So people will have to travel out of those distance areas to get. They'll have to travel many miles to get to the nearest health center for health care. And I guess you saw we had the tragedy of the boat that went down, that capsized off the Essequibo. The boat, because it would leave Georgetown and then navigate out to the mouth of the Essequibo where the Atlantic meets, and the waters, they were rough. And the boat is 87 years old, and it was carrying roughly 160 something passengers. I think they rescued 76, and 77 died, and 30 still missing. And the thing about it is they purchased a new boat in 2023, but they never completed the dock for the boat. So this boat that is 87 years old is still carrying people to this remote area of Guyana. And you know what they did with the new boat that they bought? They were having parties on it, ball. This is what they're doing, the political elites. They were having parties, the president's wife and others were having big parties and promotional on the boat. And this is where, again, and you will understand this, sister, the issue of class. Because every one of the victims of that Berrima tragedy are poor people. The wealthy people don't travel on that boat. They buy a ticket and they travel on one of the flights, local, internal flights going from one of the two airports here to inside, because they have the money. So again, the wealthy do not travel, or would never travel on that boat. It's only the poor, those who have nothing, who struggle to make a living. Those were the people who went down with that boat. The wealthy ones don't travel the boat. They'll buy an airline ticket and a plane ticket, and they travel. So again, that's a class issue. So the people who suffered were the poor. The working class people died there.
You know, you mentioned Cuba, the medical brigade, not just Guyana, every country in the region. The U.S. Harassed and threatened countries. What tools did they use to threaten countries in South America, in Central America, in the Caribbean? What do they do to, and in all of these countries, the Cuban medical doctors were loved for the reasons that you mentioned, that countries don't have the adequate infrastructure themselves. Give us an example of something that the U.S. does to get countries to bend to its will.
Well, first of all, the political elites, those who head the various political parties, the U.S. have a lot of information in them, right? Like there's a court case going on now with the new leader of the opposition, and the U.S. is seeking his extradition. He was never politically active. Someone told him, "Look, get involved in politics. So if you get a seat in parliament, it will be difficult to extradite you." And that's the leader of the Win Party. We invest in nationhood, but they all subscribe to the neoliberal economics. But the thing is, the United States government, of course, you know, the US is, and you know this because when they talk about Nigeria, the US is the most corrupt country on planet Earth. We know this. So the US have information on all of the political leaders, their bank accounts, what they do, who have connection to the drug cartels and all of that. And they use it against them, and they're happy to facilitate them because these people don't understand the difference between power and office. So they're happy to be in office. They're happy to be in office, but the external force, the US and others, call the shots. And they make tremendous concessions. So when Rubio could come in and tell them to send home the Cubans, they will do it. And they just go along with it because every one of these parties, they have, my sister, they have bank accounts and properties in the United States. They do. So they bend to the Americans. They cannot, but they couldn't do that under people like Forbes Burnham because Forbes Burnham died actually leaving nothing. When even his wife, when his wife died, she had cancer and she had to sell the paintings that they had because he was a collector of art. He loved art and sculpture. He bought the locals. And she had to sell off those to pay. So there was no money because people like Burnham understood he was involved in nation building. The political elites now, with few, maybe Prime Minister Mia Mottley in Trinidad, the others like, Mia Mottley in Barbados, but the others are not interested in nation building. Guyana and Trinidad is about, especially in Guyana, it's about enriching a cabal, enriching your friends and families and those who are close to the party. This is what is going on. So you will find ministers with 16 properties or ministers with companies, other people fronting for them. And this is what. So that is what they're happy with. They're not happy with dismantling this plantation, changing the imbalance in power and wealth and the unequal and the social and economic relations we have. It's just a we've just modified the plantation. So people are now, instead of chattel slavery, we have wage slaves because what you get, you just work and work and work, and you can't even buy it because the cost of living is high, and to rent, you know, to find a home, a decent home, and all of that is a lot of money. So there's a lot of suffering, and because they have this lopsided, their conception of development is very lopsided, because they're talking about building more hotels and the digital this and AI centers and all of that, but the hospital, healthcare, adequate nutrition, proper wages, money for pensioners, and so. It's terrible, and people are really annoyed. And this Burima tragedy that we had, there's demonstrations all over the country, and we are part of it and all of that, and we're helping to facilitate, help the young ones, to guide them and those, but we do not direct anything. We don't direct anything. We act as facilitators, and so because we take that revolutionary, that Freirean approach, that the best way that people have to learn to make decisions is by making decisions themselves.
And we've talked about Cuba, and as everyone knows, anybody listening to our channel knows, the U.S. is conducting a siege, a genocidal siege against Cuba, preventing it from getting oil, excuse me, creating blackouts. And if you don't have electricity, how can hospitals run? How can schools run? If you don't have fuel, people say there's garbage piling up. Well, if there's no fuel for sanitation trucks, of course the garbage is going to pile up. People are dying, quite literally. The infant mortality rate is rising. Cuba's being devastated. And so people are leaving. And one of the countries that Cubans are going to is Guyana. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, well, going back to Guyana, President Forbes Burnham was one of the first persons at the time after Mexico. Burnham led the charge with Manley in recognizing Cuba and bringing Cuba into the CARICOM into the fold. And Burnham visited Cuba, and I can remember I was very young when Fidel Castro came to Guyana and people turned out. It was one of, huge crowds, and Fidel got out to greet everyone, and so he broke the security, the protocol, and we had good relations. We have been sending doctors, students to study medicine, agriculture, naval architecture in Cuba, and for years, people who couldn't afford, because to go and do medicine or dentistry, you had to come from a very wealthy family. So young people from poor working class family were able to go to Cuba and become doctors and dentists and in the area of veterinary medicine and so on. And our ties from that historically being good with Cuba. So, and there's no visa requirement. So the Cubans who come to Guyana, the Cubans, unlike the Venezuelans, don't get me wrong, the Cubans are highly educated. The Cuban workforce that come here, right? They're engineers, they're refrigeration technicians, and so, and their people employ them. But there are those who are staying, and then there are others who are moving on to Brazil because they're trying to assist, and then they go back or they take things back to Cuba. This is what they're doing. So, but they're welcome, and people they're much respected because the average Guyanese are quite aware of what Cuba did for us. When the hospitals here, the main public hospital, recommending that people's foot be chopped off, they were going to Cuba. And Cuba was dealing with that because the Cubans, can't remember if I told you about this, but the Cubans have a drug that they're trying to get outside, but because of the sanctions, they inject the foot and they reverse the process. So there is no need for amputation. And they have this drug now for Alzheimer's. You see, some Americans are going there. They treat you, and is showing that people can start remembering things and all of that. So while America is bombing and spending billions on war, the Department of War, Cuba, as Fidel said, we don't invest in bombs. We invest in, saving human lives. And the Cubans did that. The Cubans have saved many lives in this country because we had doctors misdiagnosing people, doing the wrong diagnosis. And when they go to the Cubans were there. The Cubans saved many lives. So the whole thing about sending home the Cuban brigades, the Guyanese, the average Guyanese, the mass people are very angry. And this is what they're trying to do, to strangle Cuba. But the solidarity is great. There's a number of organizations that come together to support Cuba. And they were able to buy a lot of solar panels, and they shipped containers of rice to Cuba. And there's a lot of other things. And I'm part of that. We're involved in that, but we're sending things to Cuba to, and people, the churches, the mosques, the Muslim community, the Christian community, especially the ministers who are inspired by the liberation theology. They are like Reverend, you remember, what's his name? Walker. Yes, and that's
Walker.
Yes, that's right. I met him in Cuba, and people like in the tradition of the late Dr. James Cone and those people, we have them here. Because I like to mention this. Anyone, if you read the Holy Scriptures, whether it's the Quran or the Bible, you have to support the Cuban Revolution, because the principles that the Cuban Revolution rests on, they're the truths. They're there in the Bible and the Quran. So when we have these right-wing evangelicals in the States, like the Philip Ages and all of them who are coming out of Israel, I don't know what gospels they're reading.
That's a good question. I don't know what they're reading either, especially now that Israelis are openly, literally spitting on Christians. So At any
Yes.
rate, hopefully they'll
Yeah.
stop going there. As we close, is there any issue that anything you wanted to raise that we haven't discussed?
Well, the latest is this. I think what's happening in Venezuela is like the Chavistas, the different organizations, because they're different formations, political formation. I think the Chavistas are they're very restless. So a lot of pressure is being exerted on Delcy Rodriguez and others in the leadership of the PSUV, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela. Because one of the things an activist in Venezuela said is that the recent earthquake, they had the two earthquake, the US troops that went into a particular area, they did not go out to rescue the victims of the quake. They were mapping the areas where the wealth, where strategic, various mineral resources are. That's what they're doing. But the Cuba, that is being strangled, Cuba, economic genocide, Cuba sent in a rescue team because the Cubans are good in the area of disaster management and so on. The Cubans sent in a rescue team into Venezuela to assist, to pull people from under the rubble and so on, and Cuba. And as you can see, with all the pressure that they're putting on Cuba, 37 countries in the recent Central American and Caribbean Games, and Cuba emerged as number 3 with 50 gold medals, women winning half, the men, and 100 and something medals. With Mexico with more than 200 million people and energy sector, no sanctions. So it tells you something about the Cuban, the resilience. And I just want to say this because I did send you something some time ago. This is important. That when we speak as Pan-Africanists and African liberation, I always remember Kwame Toure's words. He said to us that Fidel Castro is probably the blackest man in Latin America, in the Americas. And our sisters and brothers need to do this, that the Cubans, if you compare all the countries in this part, the Cubans have a lot of women are ambassadors and they're Africans. Whether it's Trinidad, all over, you can see this. And I'm telling you, but highly educated, conscious people who represent the Cuban Republic. And as Pan-Africanists, as freedom fighters, we have to stand with Cuba. We have to stand with Cuba. And as a Christian, as Muslims, we have to stand with Cuba. We have to stand with Cuba.
And that is the perfect. Oh, go ahead.
It is said, Jesus said, no greater love in John's gospel than the one who laid down his life for his friend. And that's what Cuba did. Cuba sent troops who went to Angola, to Mozambique, and laid down their lives for freedom.
Well, thank you. That's a perfect note to end our discussion. Thank you so much, Gerald Perreira of the Organization of the Victory of the People in Guyana. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sister. It's always a pleasure to be on your program.
Thank you.
And, I salute you always as a veteran freedom fighter.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Bye-bye.
Okay, sister. All right. Yeah, all the best.